Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington as the White House and the rapidly shrinking field of presidential candidates face the fallout from former President Trump's landslide victory in last night's Iowa caucuses, with New Hampshire now just 1 week away. The former president took home more than 50% of the Iowa caucus vote. It was a record-setting 30-point victory. He carried every single county except for one where he trailed by just one single vote. Ron DeSantis eked out a second-place finish over Nikki Haley, and the field is now effectively just those three: Trump, DeSantis, and Haley. Vivek Ramaswamy dropped out last night endorsing Trump, and Asa Hutchinson ended his campaign this morning. As for the frontrunner, his first stop after Iowa wasn't on the campaign trail, but back in a courtroom. The former president voluntarily spent part of the day in Manhattan for jury selection in a civil trial that will determine how much he owes writer E. Jean Carroll for defaming her. It comes after a separate jury found the former president liable for sexually assaulting her. And it is his third such voluntary appearance off the trail and in a courtroom in just the last 2 weeks, as the Trump campaign tries to convince primary voters that his many legal liabilities are part of a conspiracy to derail his candidacy. And it all comes as the former president took a victory lap last night, urging all voters to unite around his campaign.
I want to congratulate Ron and Nikki for having a good time together. We're all having a good time together. And I think they both actually did very well. I really do. I think they both did very well. I really think this is time now for everybody, our country, to come together. We want to come together. Whether it's Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative, it would be so nice if we could come together and straighten out the world.
As for the rest of the field, or what remains of it, DeSantis and Haley both tried to claim strategic victories while vowing to push on to New Hampshire and beyond.
I can tell you, because of your support, in spite of all of that they threw at us, everyone against us, we've got our ticket punched out of Iowa.
I can safely say tonight, Iowa made this Republican primary a two-person race.
Well, both candidates have their work cut out for them. The results in Iowa highlighted how Trump has remade the Republican Party in his image. 41% of the electorate last night was 65 years old or older, up 27 percentage points from the 2016 caucuses. They were one of Trump's highest performing demographics in 2024. More Iowans identified as very conservative last night than they did in 2016. And they were also a major part of Trump's winning coalition. And nearly 2/3 of caucus goers even said they believed Trump would be fit to serve, even if he were convicted of a crime. And joining me now with some more insight into the full transformation of the Republican Party into the party of Trump, and more on where this primary is going, a man who needs no introduction. Here's NBC News chief political analyst, Chuck Todd.
Well, Gabe, before I get to New Hampshire, I want to start with a little bit of how Donald Trump's remaking the Republican Party in his image. Let me just drill down in one question from the entrance poll. Shares my values here. 41%. This was most important candidate quality. And if you look by voter here, Donald Trump got 43% of the shares my values voters. DeSantis sitting at 31, Haley at 13. This is actually one of DeSantis's better performing groups. But here's what's amazing about that 43% for Trump. In 2016, do you know the number of Iowa Republicans that said Donald Trump shared their values? 5%. Just 5%. And this is what we saw all over, the very conservative number. Whatever Trump says is conservative is now considered very conservative, and he wins these very conservatives. This is Trump's party. He's remaking the party in his image. The groups of voters that were in Iowa that were not Trumpkins in 2016, some of them have become Trump voters now more than ever. It's just fewer that are left for Haley or DeSantis to consolidate. So what does that mean for New Hampshire? Well, let me take you there. And you'll see that for Haley to pull this off, she's going to have to essentially run the table on everybody that is from 2016 that was not named Trump or Cruz. Because what we saw Trump do in Iowa is consolidate the Cruz, these movement conservatives from 2016 who now see themselves as part of the Trump coalition. So you start adding these two together, the 35 and the 11 here, and he's basically rounding up, sitting at 47%. So then Haley, in order to pull this off, needs Kasich's 15, plus Jeb's 11, there's 26, plus Rubio's 10, there's 36. We'll round up, give you 37. Throw in the Christie, and we're sitting at 43. So she'd be at 43, and that's taking all of the candidates that we saw in 16 do, and hope more Democrats and independents show up. Look, is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Is it probable? That, not over a 50% probability, that's for sure. And if she doesn't win here, if there is no place here that stops him, the question is really going to be, where is this going to happen? Because it's not clear that there's a place outside of New Hampshire where Trump is going to lose. Let me show you this map here when you start to look at where things are headed. So you got New Hampshire. So if she doesn't win there, what's next? Where else is Trump going to lose? Is he going to lose in Nevada? He changed the rules there. That's all. Is he going to lose in the Virgin Islands? Does that even matter? Then we get to South Carolina. You have to go a month before we get to South Carolina. So if he wins Iowa, New Hampshire, it's a month before you get to the next competitive place. Michigan, in theory, is a competitive primary. Times can be an open primary. But as you can see, without winning in New Hampshire, this isn't about a close second anymore. This is like the NFL playoffs. If you win, you keep going. If you lose, even by a point in New Hampshire, you're not going to be able to make the rationale that you can stop Trump from getting this nomination.
Chuck Todd, thank you. And let's go out to the trail right now. NBC's Garrett Haake is following the Trump campaign. NBC's Dasha Burns is following the DeSantis campaign. And NBC's Ali Vitale is following the Haley campaign. Garrett, I want to start with you. You're in New Hampshire right now. And the Trump campaign probably could not have drawn up a better night than yesterday. What is next for them coming out of Iowa?
Yeah, Gabe, last night went better even than the Trump campaign had hoped for, with them getting above that 50% threshold in Iowa. Obviously, the former president spent much of his day today in a courtroom in New York City. He's got a rally here in New Hampshire in about an hour. They are doing what for the Trump campaign amounts to stepping on the gas, increasing the number of events that we're going to see the candidate doing in a state like New Hampshire, basically one big media market. It doesn't sound like a lot, but based on the campaigning that he had to do to run away with it in Iowa, it is an uptick in activity. And the other thing we're going to see from Donald Trump, which we've already started to see here on the airwaves in New Hampshire, is increasing his attacks on Nikki Haley specifically, both from his campaign and from his super PAC, running ads, particularly on her record on Social Security and on immigration. They think those are ways in which they can continue to kind of damage her brand here, while all riding on the back of what is a pretty strong coalition he already has in place here from 2016, would the state by nearly 20 points, Gabe.
And Garrett, as we power through these technical issues sometimes in that crowded room right there, I want to ask you about last night's victory speech. It was a more disciplined speech than we've seen him give on the trail. You know, he was talking about that his competitors did very well. Should we read more into that? Is he beginning to pivot to a more general election message?
No, Gabe, I don't think this is the start of a trend. I think that was probably a bit more of a one-off. It felt to me like the rally speech ambient, more magnanimous towards his opponents. I think cognizant of the fact that a lot of the people who were watching him speak last night probably don't watch him speak regularly. Very surprised if he puts away the pugilism anytime soon on the campaign trail. That's just never been the way he's operated, you know, for more than a day or a speech or so at a time.
Garrett Haake in New Hampshire. Garrett, thank you. And Dasha, I want to switch over to you now. You're also in New Hampshire now, and Ron DeSantis focused all his attention on Iowa. He, bet the farm, essentially. He finished in a distant second, but he says he punched his ticket. How does the campaign view last night?
Yeah, it's a weird kind of caucus hangover day, if you will, Gabe, because this morning, when normally after the Iowa caucus, all of the candidates rush to New Hampshire, right? Instead, you've got Trump going to court in New York, and you've got DeSantis heading to South Carolina. First, I spent the morning there in Greenville with him, and he sounded very much the victor, not the sound of a candidate who lost by 30 points, got to second place, and only edged out his opponent, Nikki Haley, for that second place finish by about 2 points. Instead, today, he was on the trail stumping as though he won the whole thing. But that's the problem, is I was asking him, you know, Iowa, all right, how do you feel about those margins? Here's what he told me.
So what I showed is, yes, we obviously came in second, but amongst the broader Republican electorate, I was viewed very favorably. I mean, like what we did in Iowa, we did make an impression on a lot of those folks. I had people come up to me saying, I love you, man. I'm going to do Trump this time and do you next time. Now, that's not what I wanted to hear, but being there, we did make an impression.
That's the other kind of curious thing, what you heard there, talking about a voter telling him, look, I really like you, I'm voting for Trump, but I want you next time. That's not quite the anecdote that you typically would hear from somebody trying to win a primary nomination against Donald Trump. But there you have it. Look, he went to South Carolina, Nikki Haley's home turf, because their strategy, their plan, the reason he's so confident about getting that ticket punched out of Iowa, they really believe that means he is in it for the long haul, that if he can get to South Carolina and then some of those Super Tuesday states that are much more conservative than New Hampshire, then he has a shot, especially in South Carolina, to make this a two-person race between him and Donald Trump. And then from there, who knows? That's the big question mark that I still haven't been able to get either him or his team to really articulate to me, like what is the path forward there mathematically to beating Trump. But he does think that he could beat Haley in South Carolina.
Well, I want to pick up on that point, Dasha. And it looks like, by the way, you've had an extremely busy day starting out in South Carolina and now in New Hampshire. But you spoke with DeSantis here and you started to touch on it at the end of your answer. Does he see a path to the nomination here? How exactly did he respond?
Well, they think that it's that month between this primary here in New Hampshire and the primary in South Carolina that's going to be critical for them, that they're going to have that time, which they think will be a big opportunity to really sink their teeth into South Carolina, to be able to build their coalition there and show what they can do among those more conservative voters. At his event in Greenville, I got to tell you, the room was overflowing with folks. There was a lot of enthusiasm for him, certainly more of his crowd there than he will have here in New Hampshire. So he really thinks if he can just make it to South Carolina, then there's potentially a shot. But again, if we're talking about Iowa setting the narrative, right, what we really saw coming out of there is Donald Trump absolutely dominant, and the non-Trump vote still split and splintered between these two candidates. And that window, I mean, is closing quicker and quicker as we speak here.
And Dasha, I remember not too long ago, Governor DeSantis was insisting that he would win Iowa. Well, here we are. Dasha Burns, live for us in New Hampshire. Dasha, thank you. And I want to turn now to Ali Vitale. And Ali, Nikki Haley says this is a two-person race now, despite coming in third in Iowa. What is the calculus inside the Haley campaign?
She says that. It doesn't necessarily make it true, but it's the narrative she's going to continue pushing, whether it's in her ads that are on the air here in the Granite State, whether it's in the interviews that she's giving into the way that she sees this next chapter of the 2024 primary. And it's certainly in the way that she's acting in regards to an upcoming debate. There was supposed to be one on Thursday night hosted by ABC News here. Haley saying to me over the weekend that she's not going to be on that stage unless Trump is on that stage. ABC has set a 5 p.m. deadline for those candidates to say whether or not they're going to attend. But smart money is on the fact that there isn't going to be a debate because Trump has stayed off those debate stages quite successfully. And Nikki Haley is now saying she's not going to be there if he's not going to show up. But listen to the way that she's casting this next phase of the race as a binary, despite the fact that that's not actually what's happening here. Watch.
75% of Americans don't want a Trump-Biden rematch. The majority of Americans don't want either one of them. I mean, are we really at the point that we're going to put two 80-year-olds as our option? While we're trying to move forward with issues that matter on inflation and education and border and law and order and these wars around the world, what are they talking about? They're having to deal with investigations. They're talking about the past. They're not moving forward, and they're not showing a vision.
And look, the really fascinating thing here is that even Haley's top supporter in New Hampshire, Governor Chris Sununu, has made clear that a win for her would be second place here. I think that we have to think about the role of second place in Iowa, as much as we talk about this sometimes as if it's a horse race and the standings are important and the polling trend lines are important. But really what second and third place did for DeSantis and Haley in Iowa is allow them to be able to just make the argument to the people who are keeping their campaigns afloat. Yes, it's organizers, yes, it's volunteers, but it's mostly donors and grassroots supporters that they should keep giving them money to just try. It becomes more and more difficult to make that argument the more you get down the calendar, and it becomes clear that you cannot notch all the delegates. Even the way that Chuck did the math in a state like New Hampshire, I remember watching New Hampshire when I was covering Trump in 2015 and 16. Turned squarely red and sort of vanquished the John Kasich dream. Then he went to South Carolina and did the same exact thing with Jeb Bush. I remember watching in a ballroom in South Carolina on the night of that primary the way the whole state turned red. It took Rubio by shock, Haley by shock, as she had supported Marco Rubio. She's on the ballot now. It's different, but I do think that they have a hard time detailing what the actual path to the nomination is. So yeah, a second place boost is nice, but you got to win somewhere eventually.
You know, Allie, I think I may have been in that same room in South Carolina in 2016. It's a long time since then. So really quickly, Allie, before I let you go, New Hampshire is a much different electorate than Iowa, obviously. Non-Republicans are free to vote there. Are we going to see her change her approach more against Trump?
Well, look, we're certainly watching her cast this in a different way. She's not taking on Trump in terms of saying he's unfit. She's not leveraging new criticisms of him, but she's bundling him with Biden in a really fascinating new way that she started last night in Iowa. She repeated the sentence several times, Trump and Biden, Biden and Trump. She's, of course, grouping them by the concept of age. That all fits with her generational argument that she's been making, that she thought Trump was the right president at that time, but that they need a new generation of leadership. It allows her to continue to try to appeal to the MAGA voters while also trying to peel off more of those independents and potential Democrats who may want to meddle or at least just play in the other party's pool, if not for a little while this primary.
Yeah, so interesting, Allie, that she's now trying to lump Biden and Trump together. Should be interesting whether that argument works now. Allie Vitale, live for us in New Hampshire. Allie, thank you. And on that note, mark your calendars. We have live special coverage of the New Hampshire Republican primary coming up just 1 week from today, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on NBC News Now. Up next, I'll talk to Maryland's former governor, Larry Hogan, who's now backing Haley's bid for the White House, about the state of the race, Trump's blowout win in Iowa, and whether he's really not going to run for the White House himself. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. As we mentioned, despite a third-place finish in Iowa, Nikki Haley is now calling the Republican presidential primary a two-person race between herself and Donald Trump. As she turns her focus to New Hampshire, Haley is also sharpening her attacks against the former president. In her speech last night, Haley compared Trump to Biden, saying both lacked a vision for the future and were consumed by past grievances. Haley also said today that she will not participate in the next debate unless Trump is also on stage. Joining me now is the former Republican governor of Maryland and chairman of An America United, Larry Hogan. Last month, he stepped down from his position as a co-chair of the No Labels group, and ahead of last night's caucuses, he threw his support behind Nikki Haley. Governor, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And Governor, last night, Haley said that Iowa made the primary a two-person race, as we've been saying. You know, given Trump's dominance last night, aren't Republicans saying that they do not want a Trump alternative? We've been hearing so much about, you know, that Republicans are hungry for a Trump alternative. Doesn't last night's results go against that?
I'm not sure. Look, I think it was a very strong night for President Trump, as we expected it to be in Iowa. That's sort of the heart of MAGA country, and no one Ron DeSantis was saying for quite a while that he was guaranteeing a win, so it wasn't a very good night for him. But Nikki Haley came from nowhere, from 2% to up to about 20%. But yeah, Trump comes out of there with a lot of momentum, no surprises. However, the winner of the Iowa caucus usually is not the nominee. It hasn't been for 24 years. So New Hampshire is going to be a whole different ballgame. I mean, you could make the argument it's a one-person race, but I believe it is potentially a two-person race. And the poll came out today in New Hampshire that has Trump at 40, Haley at 40, and DeSantis at 4%. So I think that if that poll is anywhere close to being accurate, it is a two-person race.
Yeah, other polls have her down by several points, but point taken, she is doing much better in New Hampshire than she was in Iowa. But, Governor, if she does not win New Hampshire, is her campaign over?
You know, New Hampshire kind of has a way of surprising people, and we've had some unusual outcomes. I don't know that she needs to win. I mean, everybody expects Trump to win all the primaries, but I think she does have a chance, an outside chance to pull this off and win the race. But a strong second-place finish could give her some momentum as she heads into her home state of South Carolina.
Wait a minute, Governor, you're setting expectations there. No one expects Donald Trump not to win New Hampshire. Her campaign is, saying that they will win New Hampshire. And as you just said, the polls are showing that she's really close to doing that. So if she doesn't win New Hampshire, and then we head to South Carolina, I know she's from there, Governor, but what happens there? Trump is so far ahead.
Yeah, well, right now, Trump is ahead. I mean, he's sort of taken over the Republican Party in most of the states under the primary process. So if the election were held today, Trump would probably win South Carolina. My point was, if she comes out with a win or a very close, she's neck and neck with Trump in New Hampshire, it could give her the boost that she needs to go back home. It's Trump's race to lose. It looks as if Trump is very strongly, potentially going to be the nominee, which is not my preferred outcome. But I really do believe that Nikki Haley has a shot, whether she wins or places a close second in New Hampshire. It's going to be a whole different story than Iowa.
So, Governor, you just said if Trump is the likely nominee, if that does happen, what are you, Larry Hogan, going to do?
Well, it's a tough question. Look, I've been saying for a long time, I agree that you were talking a moment ago, Nikki Haley is now using some of the messaging I've been using for the past year, that 70% of the people in America do not want that rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. They're the two least popular presidents in American history. They've both got tremendous problems. Donald Trump has about 50% of the Republicans. Back to your first question, about 50% do not want Donald Trump. However, they've been spread between, it was 11 or 13 candidates, which is why we've got to get it down to a two-person race. He doesn't control all of the votes. And in the Democratic Party, it's even worse. I think 59% of Democratic primary voters would prefer someone other than Joe Biden.
And, Governor, look, Donald Trump has essentially reshaped the modern Republican Party. How much longer can moderates such as yourself survive within the party?
Well, I'm a lifelong, I would say, common sense conservative. I don't call myself a moderate, but the party has certainly moved to the right of me and has become a different, I come from the Republican wing of the Republican Party, more traditional Republican rather than the MAGA wing. And, that's less than 50% of the people consider themselves part of that. But, he really has captured the attention. It's very difficult. It's either going to happen in this election or somewhere down the road. But it's not Ronald Reagan's party anymore. That's for sure.
And Governor Reynolds said yesterday that if Trump is the GOP nominee, she, of course, endorsed Governor DeSantis, but if Trump is the nominee, she says that she would support him. And we're seeing the GOP establishment fall in line. More senators are coming out endorsing Donald Trump over the last couple of days. What is your message to them?
Well, look, it's frustrating to me that so many people are falling in line, and they really behind closed doors, people will say directly they agree with me that they're very concerned about Trump, and yet they're afraid to not get behind him. I'm not going to be one of them. I'm not going to support Trump no matter what. I don't think Donald Trump or Joe Biden should be the next president, and I'm hopeful that we can come up with some kind of an alternative in either a new Democratic nominee, a better Republican nominee, or potentially another choice.
So if Trump is the nominee, who do you plan to vote for? I know in 2020, correct me if I'm wrong, you wrote in Ronald Reagan. I mean, what do you plan to do this time?
Yeah, I haven't voted for Trump in either one of his two elections, and so I probably won't do it again this time. I mean, I won't do it again in this election. But
would you vote for Biden?
I won't vote for Biden either. I think he's a terrible president. I think he's moved the country into too far left of a direction, and I think he's just shown weakness to the world. I don't think he's up to the job, frankly. And so I'm still hopeful that I think the Democratic Party, if I could give them some advice, I really think that Joe Biden's family and some of the leaders in the party ought to tell him to take the bow. And he said he was going to be a transitional president. Let him do that and walk away before this race. I'm afraid he's the only Democrat in America that can't beat Donald Trump.
And Governor, before I let you go, I want to get you on the record one more time. You stepped down from your position as co-chair of No Labels. Are you 100% ruling out that bid for the White House in 2024?
You know, my position on No Labels hasn't changed. I've never made any indication, taken any steps to try to, you know, I'm not out there trying to campaign for that. I don't even know if it's going to be necessary. No Labels may or may not, depending on what happens over the next couple of months, launch a campaign. They have about 12 people they're talking about. I'm flattered that they're considering me one of them. I haven't slammed the door on that idea, but it's certainly not something that I'm focused on. I'm focused on trying to help Nikki Haley beat Donald Trump in New Hampshire.
And really quickly, before I let you go, we've reported that there have been conversations between Chris Christie and No Labels. Would you support Chris Christie for a third-party candidacy?
Chris Christie's. Yeah, I'm not sure Chris Christie has any interest, and they do have sore loser laws that if you were running in the primary, you can't run as an independent. So I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I'm a good friend of Chris Christie, and I appreciate his efforts standing up and telling the truth about Donald Trump.
Governor Larry Hogan, thank you so much for joining us. And we should note that we did reach out to the DeSantis campaign for a guest to join today's show, and we did not get a response. The invitation remains open. After the break, Biden and the Big Four. The president just invited top congressional leaders to the White House with a partial government shutdown, potentially now just days away. Details next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The federal government is effectively shut down today thanks to a winter storm that dumped a few inches of snow on the nation's capital. But Congress has until Friday to reach a deal on spending limits to avoid an actual partial government shutdown and less than 3 weeks to avoid a full government shutdown. It comes as President Biden has now invited the so-called Big Four congressional leaders and key committee chairs to the White House tomorrow to discuss an emergency supplemental spending deal to send aid to Israel and Ukraine in exchange for legislation on border security. Those negotiations have been stalled amid ongoing talks in the Senate. And joining me now is Monica Alba at the White House and Ryan Nobles on Capitol Hill. Monica, I want to start with you. The White House, by and large, has not wanted to get the president himself involved in these negotiations so far. So what changed, and what does the president hope to get out of this meeting tomorrow?
Exactly, Gabe. These kinds of big meetings are reserved for big moments, and the White House is kind of acknowledging what we've known for some time now, which is really the urgency of this moment with respect to funding to Ukraine. Now, this is something that the White House has been telegraphing for a long time, effectively saying that the last package that went to Ukraine for weapons and military aid has gone out the door, and there won't be another one without Congress funding this fight in Ukraine, defending itself against Russia. And this is something that President Biden, now face-to-face with the main congressional leaders and with some key committee chairs, is going to be communicating, again, pressing for why this is needed at this moment. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and the White House is keenly aware that this conversation is linked directly to some of these other national security conversations, like the border and like these other discussions that we've had over money to Israel and to Taiwan. So this national security supplemental is running on its own track, and it's something the White House would really like to have seen done yesterday, they would tell you. But they're gathering and having this meeting at the White House tomorrow to really stress that the time for action is now, and they're going to try to re-up some of those implications of what happens if this supplemental doesn't get across the finish line. But again, it's in the context of some of these other big domestic conversations we're having.
Yeah, Monica, they've been hammering that message now for several weeks. And Ryan, I want to turn to you. Chuck Schumer and Mike Johnson released their legislation on Sunday to avert the shutdown. What's the reception been like on the Hill?
Well, by and large, Gabe, there is a sense that they'll ultimately be able to get this package over the finish line with minimal disruption to the funding of federal government. There is the possibility that it extends into the weekend, but it gets done before there's any kind of real impact to the work of the federal government. But it's not going to be passed without a lot of whining, particularly from House Republicans, the most conservative members of the House Republican caucus, who are in general opposed to these short-term spending gaps and prefer to see a long-term appropriations process with a lot more cuts than what the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader in the White House have negotiated. So they're going to begin that process today. The Senate's going to take the first procedural step. The House is not in today. They had to take the day off because of travel concerns related to the winter storm that hit the Northeast. So it's going to take some time for it to happen, but there is the sense that ultimately they will get it done. The question is, will they be able to land these long-term appropriations deals? They will now have until early March to get that process complete.
And Ryan, let's turn now to the agreement on the child tax credit. How did that come together?
Well, this was something that was done largely behind closed doors between the chair of the Republican-led Ways and Means Committee on the House side and the chair of the Democratic-led Finance Committee on the Senate side, Ron Wyden of Oregon on the Senate side and Jason Smith of Missouri on the Republican side on the House. And they were able to come together with a number of agreements on some of these key areas that have long been an area of conflict between Republicans and Democrats, including the extension of the child tax credit. Now, Democrats are going to have to give in some areas as well, including an extension of some of the Trump tax cuts that many Democrats are opposed to. But this is one of these kind of old-fashioned congressional deals where everyone gave a little bit. Nobody loves the final product, but they like it enough to get it over the finish line. It's still going to require a lot of voting. The question is which way and which process they intend to go forward. There is a chance that maybe it gets tacked on to this spending plan and they make it as part of those negotiations, or they do it separate. Those negotiations are still up in the air, but the most important leaders as related to this conversation believe that this package will ultimately pass.
And Monica, let's turn now to last night's Iowa caucuses as we were discussing. What's the reaction been like from the Biden campaign to last night's results? And does the campaign have a strategy to get voters to care about another Trump-Biden rematch?
No, it's a great question, Gabe. And really, this was something that became really quickly about fundraising last night, with the president himself saying, after we saw former President Trump's dominance in Iowa, that he is certainly coalescing and likely going to be that Republican frontrunner. So the president essentially asked his supporters to chip in and give more money. And that is why yesterday the Biden campaign chose to release their fundraising haul for the end of 2023. And they've been very clear that they are trying to amass this major war chest, of course, that's for the general election, while Republicans are still trying to figure out what to do on their end in this primary that is quickly running out of time and really of interest as the field is, of course, winnowing. So the Biden campaign is trying to rely on what they've been saying, which is the president's own accomplishments, what they feel he's been able to do through legislation. But of course, in the context of what we were just talking about, there's a lot of pressure on him to get something done as it relates to immigration and this border deal. That's something certainly that there will be a lot of political pressure on him in the campaign to answer for over the next 10 months, Gabe.
Monica Alba outside the White House and Ryan Nobles on Capitol Hill. Thank you both so much. And up next, Republican primary rivals set their sights on New Hampshire as former President Trump and President Biden set their sights on a general election rematch. The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. Turning back now to the campaign trail and some other notable storylines from last night's Iowa caucuses and what they could signal about the 2024 general election. Because while former President Trump won big, there are still notable splits inside his party, which could loom large this November. As we mentioned, according to last night's entrance polls, about a third of Republican caucus goers said Mr. Trump would not be fit to be president if he's convicted of a crime. That's a sizable chunk of Republicans. And Trump, of course, is facing 91 criminal counts and appeared in a New York City courtroom today for a civil defamation trial. But on an issue that is fundamental to the next election, 2/3 of Republican caucus goers said they did not think President Biden legitimately won the 2020 election, a false claim Trump has repeated since losing it. And to break this all down, I'm joined now by my panel. Daniella Diaz, congressional reporter at Politico. Mo Elleithee, executive director of the Institute of Politics and Public Service at Georgetown University, and Jim Geraghty, senior political correspondent at the National Review. Thank you all so much for joining us and for braving the snowy roads to come in here into the studio. Daniella, I want to start with you. What was your big takeaway from last night and those entrance polls?
The Republican Party is still Trump's party. That was really what we saw in Iowa. He won even before some caucus goers had a chance to caucus in the random elementary schools that they were all at. He really took it by storm. He won.
And the DeSantis campaign was not happy about that, for sure.
Not happy at all. And it shows that regardless of how hard, we've seen DeSantis and Haley campaign in Iowa, of course, now they're switching their sights to New Hampshire. That's where they are now. It's still Trump's party, and he won last night, and he still has a huge hold over the Republican Party base.
And Mo, I want to get your thoughts on Iowa last night, but I also want to ask you about this Biden campaign message. And I was with him last week in South Carolina, and he's talking about threats to democracy. He's been making that message, hitting that message over and over again for the last several months. Do you think voters are going to buy that message?
Look, I think it is one of the starkest contrasts that they can make with Donald Trump. And a lot of people were naysayers of the president when he tried to make that the focus of the 2022 midterms. And it seemed to work to great effect. Sort of the dual contrast of democracy being on the ballot and reproductive rights for women were the central Democratic message in 2022 when they had a pretty good year. Sounds familiar, right? Because that's what they're leading with this time. So I think there's some real opportunity there.
And Jim, what surprised you about last night?
So I believe last I saw the turnout was around 110,000 compared to 2016, last time Republicans had a competitive Iowa caucus. It was like 180,000. It's a Trumpier party, but it's also conceivably a smaller party. I'm going to be keeping an eye on subsequent primaries, how that turnout compares. Now, it was frigid cold in Iowa.
And there was a much more vibrant, primary in 2016, a lot more
much more competitive than there was a playoff football game going. You can come up with reasons for why it would be smaller.
A holiday,
But it's 70,000 is a pretty steep drop. And my thinking is that, one, it's not a competitive race, the Republicans into it. But the other thing is that a lot of people who used to be Republicans, Mitt Romney, John McCain Republicans, all those suburban soccer moms, white-collar professionals, those folks are independents or Democrats now. They're not coming back to this party.
And, Jim, I want to put up something that President Biden tweeted. This election, he says, was always going to be be you and me versus extreme MAGA Republicans. So does this message of us versus them really resonate, considering, he was talking about in 2020 that he would unite the country? Now he really is setting this up to be a battle between himself and Donald Trump. By the way, the Biden campaign is ignoring DeSantis and Haley completely. But us versus them, will that work?
What's he going to run on? The border? Inflation? All these other issues? All these terrible numbers and everything else. But he's always said, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And that's what he's got to do. They probably conceivably the only Republican that Biden could beat is Donald Trump. And the Republican primary voters are like, yes, let's go with that guy.
And Daniella, look, we've been seeing more and more establishment Republicans get behind Donald Trump in just the last few days. Among them, Senator Marco Rubio, I think he came out on Sunday. How much longer will the rest of the party wait before they officially get behind Trump?
I was just talking about this with my coworkers as I cover Congress, and the Senate's in today, the House is not. But there are two very prominent Republicans that have not endorsed Trump who are going to be on the Hill in just a few hours, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, the two Iowa Republicans who, and Joni Ernst campaigned for Haley, I should say, and they have not endorsed Trump. And a lot of Senate Republican leadership hasn't endorsed Trump either. So as he continues winning these caucuses and these primaries, is what we expect. We'll see what happens in New Hampshire. These members are going to have to say where they stand on the issue of Trump, the huge elephant in the room that they've been trying to dodge the last couple of months.
Will there be a price to pay for some of those members since they didn't endorse him before Iowa, do you think?
We all know how Trump operates. He always comments when people don't support him outright. He has not commented yet, but it could be an issue going forward, especially if it's members who are in leadership. I haven't even mentioned Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is the top Republican in the Senate, has not endorsed Trump, tries to dodge the topic of Trump. And they have in the past had a very intense rivalry. I expect that could continue.
And Mo, we kept saying that Iowa was make or break for Ron DeSantis. Is New Hampshire make or break for Nikki Haley?
Yes.
If she comes in second, her campaign's now trying to say, oh, if we come in second, it'll be okay. But
yeah, I mean, look, if she comes in a super close second, like a point or two behind, she'll find a reason to keep going. But she's got to beat him. She has to beat him outright to be able to make a real case. Now, look, there are a lot of candidates in political, in political graveyards who did really well in New Hampshire, but it didn't catch on beyond that. Why? Because the states that follow New Hampshire act a lot more like Iowa than they do New Hampshire. And so Haley has to have that New Hampshire win in order to make any case before she faces some real headwinds after.
That momentum, though, if she were to win New Hampshire, could be potentially huge. But yes, as you say, heading to South Carolina, it's a difficult path forward any way you look at it. Jim, Haley said today that she would only participate in the next debate if Donald Trump was on the stage. And look, she keeps saying it's a two-person race, even though she came in third. I get it, why she's saying that. But regular Americans, if you finish third, how can you say it's a two-person race? But what do you make of the decision to basically try to be above the fray and not worry about Ron DeSantis and not go to this debate?
Well, she's adopting kind of what Trump did. Well, I'm way ahead of you in the polls, so I don't have to debate you little guys. Now, technically, she was third, but she's going to be well ahead of DeSantis in New Hampshire. I think she's ahead in South Carolina, although they're both pretty darn, far behind there. I think the lesson is, America, you've got nothing on TV Thursday night. There's not going to be this debate, and there's probably not going to be that other one, and we're probably not going to have any debates till the general election. And oh, by the way, both sides have made noises about skipping those two.
Yeah, and I want to play some of Nikki Haley's speech last night, and something she's been saying now in the last several hours today, where she tries to lump President Biden and former President Trump. Let's take a listen.
Trump and Biden are both about 80 years old. Trump and Biden both put our country trillions of dollars deeper in debt, and our kids will never forgive them for it. Trump and Biden both lack a vision for our country's future. Our campaign is the last best hope of stopping the Trump-Biden nightmare.
The Trump-Biden nightmare, Daniella, and she's, bringing age into this more so today and last night than she did before. What do you make of this? Is it going to work at all?
It's a new strategy. Clearly, she thinks this has a opportunity to help her ahead of New Hampshire, ahead of South Carolina. Unclear right now whether that will work, but it is a major concern on both sides that Biden is old. I mean, and he's in his 80s. We hear that continuously from voters, and Trump is around the same age. It's an interesting argument, especially coming from her. Interesting, she's not, she always talks about being a woman, a female candidate. Now she's really talking about how much older they are.
And new strategies at the last minute almost never work, right? Like it's too late to be shifting gears. She's doing what she's got to do. And drawing a starker contrast with Trump is one thing, but trying a whole new line of attack.
Okay, you look at public polling. Americans are not thrilled that Biden is running for another term. They're definitely not thrilled about the idea of returning that. So there's this whole like this. How did we end up with these two guys again? How did this? So running essentially a general election campaign. Right. Like I don't know whether she's actually interested in no labels. And Larry Hogan said that there's a chance you can't, sore loser laws and all that kind of stuff. But she's kind of saying, America, aren't you sick of these two guys?
Right. But
as long as independents can vote, she could do okay.
In New Hampshire. There's a lot of primaries, though, before the November election. Thank you all so much for joining us. Daniella Diaz, Mo Elleithee, Jim Geraghty, thank you all. And still to come, a narrowing field, a historic margin for first, and an electorate transformed. One of Iowa's top political experts joins me next to dig into last night's lessons and aftermath. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
This is the third time we've won, but this is the biggest win. They said, well, if you win by 12%, that's a big win. That's going to be very hard to do. Well, I think we more than doubled that, I guess, tripled it maybe. They said, you'll never get over 50, and I just left and we were at 54. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with it, but they said, you can't do that, sir.
And welcome back. Perhaps one of the loudest messages from caucus goers last night was how Donald Trump has redefined what it means to be a Republican in the heartland. As we mentioned earlier, last night's electorate in Iowa was notably different than 2016 when Ted Cruz won, with help from evangelicals and other values-based voters and Trump skeptics. This time around, though, caucus goers were older, less evangelical, and above all, fervently pro-Trump. I'm joined now by Kathie Obradovich, editor-in-chief of the Iowa Capitol Dispatch. Kathie, thanks so much for joining us. And picking up on that point, how else has Iowa's Republican electorate changed since 2016?
Well, I think that you hit an important point when you mentioned that the electorate was less evangelical. It's kind of interesting. There are still lots of evangelicals in Iowa, but they are functioning pretty much the same as other Republicans. It used to be that there was pretty much of a divide with evangelicals being to the right of the regular Republican Party on issues like abortion or some of these other cultural issues that are being discussed these days in state houses all over the country, including in Iowa. So you look at, who will the evangelicals support? They're going to support, the same candidates that everybody else is supporting. And they're more likely, I think, to go to caucus, though, however.
Yeah, and Governor DeSantis went so hard after evangelicals, and so many of them ended up going for Donald Trump. So, Kathie, is there any Republican who could have challenged Trump in Iowa and won?
I don't. If there is someone, I don't know who it would be. Donald Trump, extremely popular in Iowa. The caucuses certainly bore that out. And you look at these candidates that we saw. I mean, most of them were not trying to be really different from Donald Trump. They were trying to say, well, we're going to do Donald Trump, but we're just going to do it better than him because we're younger or we don't have the baggage that Donald Trump does. That was certainly Ron DeSantis's message. And that's just not, it wasn't persuasive to Trump supporters, frankly. You're just not pulling people away with that messaging.
And Kathie, I'm curious your thoughts on this. Kim Reynolds has been a popular governor there in Iowa, but did her endorsement of DeSantis hurt her?
I think that remains to be seen. There were some polls that suggested that her job approval took a hit after that. And anecdotally, I did hear people who say, I really like Kim Reynolds, but I wish she wouldn't have endorsed Ron DeSantis because the person I'd be talking to would be pro-Trump. But she is still a very powerful governor. We're just starting off a legislative session. I fully expect that her agenda is going to prevail through this year. And so, whether people hold any kind of ill will toward her, we don't even know if she's running for re-election. I think that remains to be seen. I think it did show, though, just how really not effective big endorsements are in caucuses. People make up their own mind.
And Kathie, we kept talking about this over and over again leading up to the caucuses. But how much do you think weather was a factor in last night's low turnout?
I think it mattered a lot. It's never one thing, right? I think it was the weather combined with Trump's overwhelming lead that maybe made people look at the temperature and say, I don't need to go out and risk breaking a hip or freezing my buns off. Trump is going to win regardless. So a little bit of complacency, a little bit of weather. But I do think that the Republican Party of Iowa chairman, Jeff Kaufman, pretty much had his fingers on the pulse of this. And he was the one who said he thought it felt like 2016, it was going to be record turnout if it hadn't been for the weather. And
Kathie, I'm also curious, big picture here. What do you think of the Republican Party moving forward in Iowa? Look out 5-10 years. Will continue to change? Does a lot depend on that, on whether Trump wins re-election or not? But what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that it's inevitable that there will be changes. What direction it goes, it's hard to say. Donald Trump isn't a traditional Republican. Some people say he's not a Republican at all. He's sort of his own entity. And, when he moves on from politics, I think it explains, it depends a lot on what comes after him. So if it's somebody who's trying to carry on his legacy, or if it's somebody who's saying, okay, we've done this and we just need to go a completely different direction.
Kathie Obradovich, editor-in-chief of the Iowa Capitol Dispatch. Thanks so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And speaking of votes, it's time to plan when and where you're going to cast yours. NBC News' Plan Your Vote tool is back for the 2024 primary season. Go to nbcnews.com/planyourvote to get information on key races in your state, changes in voting rules from the last election cycle, and when and how to vote in your state's primary election. And that does it for us this hour. We're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez. NBC News Now coverage continues with Tom Costello in for Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.